My name is Callum. Callum, dear. I'm 34 years old, and I want to tell you about the smallest thing that ever changed my life. Not a fight, not a dramatic revelation, not some movie moment where someone confesses everything with tears streaming down their face while rain hammers the window. Half a second. That's all it was. A pause so small that if you'd been standing right next to us in that kitchen, leaning against the counter, holding a cup of coffee, you probably wouldn't have caught it. You'd have just seen two people in a comfortable relationship having a perfectly normal Saturday morning conversation. But I caught it. And here's the thing about being with someone for 11 years. You know them the way you know the layout of your own apartment in the dark. You don't have to think. Your hands just find the light switch, the chair, the edge of the bed. You move through their rhythms without even realizing you're doing it. Raya's laugh, the way she tilts her head when she's listening, the specific way she exhales when she's pretending something doesn't bother her. I knew all of it without trying. It was just information my brain had collected, quietly, over a decade. So when she paused, that tiny stutter in her breathing when I said the name Marcus, I felt it before I understood it. We were talking about her work conference. She'd been telling me about a team dinner the night before, somewhere downtown, and I was half listening the way you do when you're also trying to make eggs and you're not sure if you turn the burner down. She was talking about her colleague Priya, and someone named Derek who apparently told an embarrassing story about karaoke. And then I asked, just casually, just because I'd heard her mention him a few times over the past couple of months, was Marcus there? Half a second. Her face didn't change. Her voice didn't crack. She just said, yeah, he was there. He left early though, and kept talking. Perfectly normal. Perfectly smooth. Except for that half second. I didn't say anything. I flipped my eggs. I asked if Derek's karaoke story was at least funny. She laughed and said it was mortifying and launched into the details, and I stood there at the stove nodding and smiling. But something had shifted in my chest. Not panic, not yet. More like when you're walking and your foot comes down and the ground feels slightly different than you expected. You don't fall. You don't even stumble. But your body registers it. I registered it. And I kept that registration to myself, quietly, for the next several weeks. Because here's what I've learned about being the kind of person I am. I don't react to feelings. I respond to evidence. I'm not impulsive. I'm not dramatic. People who know me would probably describe me as steady, patient, maybe even a little too calm sometimes. That patience is either my greatest quality or my most dangerous one, depending on the story. This is the story where you find out which. Let me tell you about Raya. Because this story doesn't make sense without you understanding who she was to me. Who she still is, honestly, even now, even after everything. Feelings don't just evaporate because the ground shifts. I want to be honest about that up front. I met her when I was 23. She was 22. We were at a mutual friend's apartment in Toronto, one of those crowded, slightly chaotic house parties where you end up having a real conversation with a stranger because the alternative is standing awkwardly near the snack table for another hour. Raya was standing near the snack table. I was also standing near the snack table. We made a joke about it almost simultaneously and then laughed at the coincidence, and that was it. We talked for 4 hours. I missed my last subway home and took a cab instead, and I didn't even care. She was one of those people who makes you feel like the conversation matters. Like what you're saying is genuinely interesting, genuinely worth her attention. She's a good listener. An active one. She remembers details. She asks follow-up questions weeks later about things you mentioned once, in passing, and you feel seen in a way that's a little startling. We were friends for about 6 months before anything happened. Actual friends, talking on the phone at midnight, meeting for coffee, the whole thing. And then it became something else, so naturally and gradually that neither of us could really point to the exact moment. There wasn't a big declaration. One day we were friends, and then one day we weren't exactly friends anymore, and it just stayed that way. 11 years. We moved in together after 2. Navigated career changes, a cross-country move, my dad's health scare, her mom's surgery. We talked about getting married, more than once, in the comfortable, non-committal way that couples do when marriage feels eventual rather than urgent. We had a shared life. Not just shared space, shared life. Intertwined finances, intertwined friend groups, the same weird inside jokes we'd been making since 2015. She worked in corporate communications. Good at it. She had this ability to take complicated, messy situations and reframe them in ways that felt both accurate and manageable. Looking back, I find that a little more interesting than I did at the time. Marcus, I would later find out, was a consultant her company had brought in about 8 months before that Saturday morning in the kitchen. He'd been working closely with her team on some restructuring project. Late nights, pressure, the particular intimacy that comes from being in the trenches with someone professionally. I didn't know any of that context yet, that morning. All I knew was a half second. But it was enough to make me start paying attention in a different way. I want to be clear, I didn't go through her phone. I didn't install anything, didn't snoop, didn't check her email. That's not who I am, and honestly, it's also not who I wanted to be in this situation. Even with that feeling sitting in my chest, I wasn't ready to be that person. Not yet. Instead, I just watched. Which sounds cold, maybe, or calculating, but it was really more like. I started being present in a way I maybe hadn't been for a while. When she talked about work, I actually listened instead of half listening. I noticed the names she mentioned and the ones she didn't. I noticed when she seemed preoccupied. I noticed when she was on her phone more than usual, not accusatorially, just noted it the way you'd note a change in weather. About 3 weeks after the kitchen moment, she mentioned a work event on a Friday. A client dinner, she said. She'd probably be back late. She was back at 11:30, which wasn't unusual for those kinds of things. She seemed in a good mood, warm, a little wine loose, talking about how the client had been impressed and the team had done well. I was happy for her. I genuinely was. But then she mentioned, kind of casually, that Marcus had really helped pull the presentation together that week. The way she said it, it wasn't the words. It was the softness. A specific kind of warmth that was different from how she talked about Priya or Derek or anyone else on the team. I still said nothing. I filed it. I know this probably sounds strange. A lot of people have asked me, later, after everything, why I didn't just ask her. Why I didn't sit down and say, hey, is something going on with this Marcus guy? And I've thought about that a lot. Honestly, I think part of it was fear. If I asked and she said no, I wouldn't know whether to believe her. And if I asked and she said yes, well, I wasn't ready for that conversation yet. Not without being sure. Not without knowing the full shape of what I was dealing with. There was also something else, though. Something I'm a little less comfortable admitting. I think part of me was in the process of building a quiet kind of resolve. Like, if this was what I thought it might be, I didn't want to walk into that conversation uncertain and emotional. I wanted to walk in knowing. Prepared. Not to be cruel. I wasn't thinking about revenge or confrontation or any of that. I just needed, I don't know, footing. I needed to be standing on solid ground before the ground moved. Around week 5, I had lunch with my old friend Donovan. We'd been close since university. He was one of those people who had known Raya and me together almost our entire relationship. I didn't tell him what was going on, exactly. I mentioned, almost as an aside, that I felt like there was some distance between Raya and me lately, that I wasn't sure if it was work stress or something else. Donovan, who is perceptive in a way that can be occasionally inconvenient, looked at me for a long moment and said, "Are you okay?" Not, "I'm sure it's nothing." Not, "Have you talked to her about it?" Just, "Are you okay?" I said yeah. I said I was probably overthinking. He nodded slowly in the way that meant he didn't entirely believe me, but respected that I wasn't ready to say more. That's what I mean about good friends. They know when to hold the door open without pushing you through it. About 2 months after the kitchen, Raya told me she had a work conference. 2 nights, in Montreal. The whole team was going, she said. It was something her company did every year. I said that sounded good. I asked if she was looking forward to it. She said yes, a little nervous. There was a big presentation she was involved in. I asked if Marcus was going. She said yes, most of the core team would be there. No pause this time. But the question had registered. I watched her eyes for a fraction of a second too long, and she held my gaze very deliberately, the way people do when they're aware they're being looked at. Steady. Controlled. We were both performing, I realized. Just different performances. The Thursday, she left for Montreal. I drove her to the airport, kissed her goodbye, told her to knock the presentation out of the park. She smiled and said she'd call me that night. She called. Around 9. Talked for about 20 minutes. The hotel was nice. The team dinner had been good. She was tired, but in a good way. She sounded normal. She sounded like Raya. I said goodnight. I lay in bed for a long time staring at the ceiling. I still had nothing concrete. just feelings and pauses and the softness of a name. Here's what happened next, and I need you to understand that I am still, to this day, not entirely sure how I feel about this part. I have a very old friend named Tessa. We went to high school together. She now lives in Montreal. We're not super close anymore, just the comfortable way of people who knew each other when you were 17 and have stayed intermittently in touch ever since. She works in hospitality, actually, event management. I texted her Friday morning. "Just checking in," I said. She called me back within an hour, delighted to hear from me, and we chatted for a bit. At some point she asked what was new with me, and I mentioned Raya was in Montreal for a work conference. Tessa said, "Oh, fun, where are they staying?" I told her, and then, "I really didn't plan this, it just came out." I said, "Hey, do you know that hotel well?" She said she'd worked a few events there. Nice place. I didn't ask her to look into anything. I want to be completely honest. I did not ask Tessa to spy on my girlfriend. I said, "I'm sure this sounds weird, but I've just been feeling, I don't know, off about some stuff. You know when something just feels wrong, but you can't say why." Tessa, bless her, just said, "Yeah, I know." And then she said, "You want me to just, I don't know? I could swing by that hotel bar area tonight. I have a friend in the area. We've been meaning to grab dinner." I told her she didn't have to. She said she didn't mind. I said okay. I felt sick the whole rest of that afternoon. Not because I thought I'd done something wrong, exactly, but because the fact that I'd said okay meant I was now living in the version of this story where I was checking up on my girlfriend of 11 years at a hotel bar in Montreal. How had I gotten here from a half-second in a kitchen on a Saturday morning? Tessa texted me at 11:17 that night. She said, "Hey, so, I think you should probably call me when you can." I called her immediately. She'd gone to the bar. She'd been there maybe 45 minutes. She'd seen Raya with a man she didn't recognize. They were at a corner table, not a busy, team drinks kind of arrangement. Just the two of them, talking quietly. At some point, according to Tessa, Raya had reached across the table and put her hand on his. "Maybe it's nothing," Tessa said. You asked, so I'm telling you." I thanked her. I hung up. Raya called me at 11:40 that night. Sounded a little tired. Said she was just heading to bed. The presentation prep had run long. I said okay, sleep well, good luck tomorrow. My voice was completely steady. I hung up and sat on the edge of the bed and breathed for a long time. I want to say I cried that night. I want to say I broke down in some release of feeling that would at least indicate I was properly experiencing this. I didn't. I just felt very quiet, very internal. Like everything had gone still. I've talked to a therapist about this since, about why my response to emotional pain is often a kind of eerie calm, and apparently it has to do with early stuff I'm not going to get into here. The short version is, I learned very young that falling apart didn't help anything, so my nervous system learned to hold things together at the surface while processing underneath. It's useful and it's also, according to my therapist, a bit of a problem. Raya came home Sunday evening. She looked good. That specific brightness you get from a few days away, a successful work thing, feeling competent and celebrated. She hugged me. I hugged her back. She talked about the presentation going well and a funny thing that happened on the flight home. I listened. I asked questions. I had made a decision in those 2 days she was in Montreal, while I sat with what Tessa had told me, while I turned the whole thing over and over in my mind. I was not going to confront her on feeling and hearsay. I know how those conversations go. I say what I know, which, technically, was just that my friend had seen her at a bar with a man, holding his hand. She explains it. Maybe it was a comforting moment. Maybe the man was upset about something. Maybe it was completely innocent, and I had just destroyed 11 years of trust over one piece of ambiguous information interpreted through my own paranoia. Maybe, or maybe not. I needed to be sure. And I knew this about myself, that if I confronted her now, I would lose clarity. I'd get emotional. She'd get emotional. Nothing would be clean. And if I was wrong, I would have done something that couldn't be undone. So I took the long way around. I called my cousin Presley, who works in HR and deals with sensitive interpersonal situations professionally. Not to ask her anything specific about Raya. I wasn't that far gone. But just to talk to someone who knew me and who dealt with complicated human situations for a living. We had coffee and I told her, in broad strokes, what was going on. She said the hardest thing. She said, "Before you do anything, You need to know what you actually want on the other side of this. Because how you handle the next few weeks will depend entirely on what outcome you're building toward. I asked what she meant. She said, if you want to save the relationship, that's one path. If you're already past that and you need the truth for your own sanity, that's a different path. And if you're building a case because you're protecting yourself, financially, emotionally, that's a third path. You need to know which one you're on. I sat with that. I sat with that for a very long time. The thing about sharing a life with someone for 11 years is that your lives are deeply embedded in each other in ways you don't fully see until you start looking. We owned our condo together, 50-50. We had a joint account we used for shared expenses, mortgage, groceries, utilities, that sort of thing. We each also had our own individual accounts, which we'd always maintained separately by mutual agreement. That had been Raya's preference, actually. Early on, she was financially independent and wanted to stay that way, and I'd agreed because it made sense. Now I was quietly grateful for that. I talked to my financial advisor, a straightforward, no-nonsense woman named Claudette, who I'd had for about 6 years. I told her I was dealing with some personal uncertainty and wanted to review my individual financial position. She didn't ask questions. We went through everything: my savings, my investments, my stake in the condo, my insurance. She gave me a clear picture of exactly where I stood. I also talked to a lawyer. Just once, just an hour, just to understand my options if things went in the direction I was starting to suspect they might. I want to be clear, this was not a vindictive move. It was the move of a person who had learned, from watching other people go through hard things, that the worst time to figure out your legal position is in the middle of an emotional breakdown. I wasn't planning anything. I was just making sure I understood the landscape. The lawyer, a calm, thorough man named Jeffrey, explained the basics. We weren't married, which simplified certain things. The condo was co-owned, which complicated others. He gave me information. That was all. At home, everything looked the same. I was present. I was warm. I went on a weekend trip with Raya to visit her sister in Ottawa in October. Her sister Nadia, who I'd always genuinely liked. And we had a perfectly nice time. Good food, walked around the market, laughed at old photos. Normal. Inside, I was building something. Not a trap. I want to be precise about this. I was building clarity. Preparing to have a conversation that wouldn't collapse under the weight of my own emotions, because I knew myself well enough to know that I needed to go in solid. I'm not sure if that makes me wise or emotionally avoidant. Maybe both. Meanwhile, I was also, and this is the part I'm least proud of, I'll admit it, paying closer attention to patterns. Raya started going to the gym some Tuesday and Thursday evenings. New habit, she said. She'd been meaning to get back into a routine. She'd mentioned it casually, and it was entirely plausible, and I didn't say anything. But on the third Tuesday, she went to the gym. I drove by the address she'd mentioned. I'm not proud of this. I want to say that clearly. I sat in my car about half a block down and felt ridiculous and awful and also certain. Her car wasn't in the parking lot. I waited 20 minutes. Her car did not appear. I drove home. She got back about an hour later, slightly flushed, and talked about her workout. I said that was great. I asked what she'd worked on. She said legs. I said nice. I didn't feel angry. I felt sad. Deeply, quietly sad. The way you feel when something you suspected turns out to be true and part of you had been hoping you were wrong. 3 weeks later, I told Donovan everything. We were sitting in his kitchen. He and his wife Margot had us over for dinner somewhat regularly. Raya had begged off that night with a headache, and so it was just the two of us, and somewhere in the third drink I just let it out. All of it. The half-second, the conference, Tessa's text, the gym parking lot. Donovan listened to the whole thing without interrupting. He's good at that. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "How long have you been carrying this?" "About 4 months," I said. He said, "Cal, what do you need right now?" And I said I needed to have the conversation. That I'd been building up to it, and I was almost ready, and I just needed, I don't know, witness maybe. I needed someone who knew us both to know what I knew, before I said it out loud to her. I couldn't fully explain why, but it mattered. Donovan nodded. He said, "Okay, I hear you. And whatever happens, I'm here. Okay, on the other side of it, wherever that lands, I'm here." He also said something that stuck with me. "You've been so focused on being ready. Just make sure you're also being honest with yourself about what you want. Not what makes sense, not what's logical. What you actually want. I went home that night, and Raya was asleep. I stood in the bedroom doorway for a moment and looked at her. I knew what I wanted. I'd known for a while. I wanted the truth. Not because I thought it would save things. I was past that, I think, in some quiet place I hadn't fully said out loud yet. I wanted the truth because I deserved it. Because 11 years deserved it. Because whatever was going to come next, it needed to be built on something real. I chose a Sunday morning. I want to explain why Sunday. It sounds oddly specific, but there was a reason. Raya was always most herself on Sunday mornings. No work brain, no rushing. She moved slowly, made proper coffee, was calm and a little soft in a way that was different from weekdays. I wanted to have this conversation with the version of her who was real, not the version who was performing or managing. I said, I want to ask you something, and I want you to know I'm not asking to start a fight. I'm asking because I need to know the truth, and I think you know what I'm going to ask. She looked at me. Her face did something complicated, and she didn't say anything. I said, is something happening between you and Marcus? Long pause. Not a half second. A full, complete, real pause. And then she said, Callum. And I knew. You know how you can know from one word. She said my name like an apology, like something with weight, and I knew. How long? I said. She looked at the counter. She said about 4 months. I did the math. Right around the conference. Maybe just before. I asked if they were. If it was, I couldn't quite finish the sentence, so she did it for me. She said yes. It was a real thing, not just one incident. I nodded. I said, okay. She looked up at me. I think she expected me to raise my voice. I don't know what she expected. I was sitting across from her at the kitchen island with my coffee, and my hands were completely still, and I said, okay. I love you, she said. She sounded like she meant it, which made it worse and better simultaneously. I don't know how this happened. It wasn't supposed to. I said, that's the thing about things that aren't supposed to happen. They don't ask permission. She nodded. I said, I need you to know that I've known something was wrong since the first time you paused when I said his name. Months ago. I knew. And I spent all that time not saying anything because I wanted to be sure I wasn't crazy and because I needed to figure out where I stood before I got here. She stared at me. I think this surprised her more than anything. More than the question, more than my calm. The fact that it had started with a half second that I'd caught. I noticed a pause, I said. Just half a second. Most people wouldn't catch it. She put her hand over her mouth. We sat like that for a long moment. What happened next was not a single dramatic event. It was an architecture. A series of decisions made quietly, deliberately, without chaos. Raya stayed in the condo for a few weeks while we worked out the practical side of things. We had to, logistically. She slept in the guest room. We were civil, honestly more than civil. There's something about finally saying the true thing out loud that releases a kind of tension you didn't know was holding the whole structure rigid. I had already talked to Jeffrey the lawyer. I already knew my financial footing. That meant when it came time to sort out the condo, which we eventually agreed to sell, splitting it evenly, I wasn't figuring it out in a fog of grief. I was navigating it from something resembling solid ground. I moved into a temporary furnished apartment in January. A good building in a part of the city I'd always liked but never lived in. It felt surprisingly okay to be there. I don't know what I'd expected, that I'd walk into the empty space and collapse. Maybe. But there was actually something in it that felt like the beginning of something rather than just the end. Donovan helped me move. Margot sent food. She made this enormous pot of her family's soup recipe that lasted me 4 days, and I will never forget that as long as I live. I told my family in pieces. My parents were devastated in a quiet way. My mother cried. My dad held it together, but called me every day for 2 weeks just to check in. My sister Bridget flew out from Vancouver for a weekend, and we didn't even really talk about it. We just watched bad movies and ate takeout, and that was exactly right. I want to tell you about one more conversation, because I think it matters. About 6 weeks after Raya and I separated, she texted me asking if she could call. I said yes. She called, and she started by saying she was sorry. She said it more than once, carefully, and I believed her. She said Marcus hadn't been worth it, that she'd ended it, that it had fizzled out almost immediately once the situation with us became real. I didn't say anything for a moment. Then I said, Raya? I'm not angry at you. I want you to know that. I've spent a lot of time with this, and I'm not angry. I'm sad. There's a difference. She was quiet. I said, I think we'd been slowly becoming roommates for a while before any of this. And maybe you felt that and didn't know how to say it. And I don't know. Maybe I felt it too and didn't want to. And Marcus was just. He was available. And maybe it felt like aliveness when things had gotten slow and quiet. She said, that doesn't make it okay. I said, no, but it makes it human. I think she cried. I'm pretty sure. I said, I hope you figure out what you actually want. I really do. But I'm going to go do the same thing. We said goodbye. We've texted a handful of times since. Practical things, finalization of the condo stuff, a couple of small exchanges around mutual friends. It's been careful and mostly okay. I want to be honest with you. The aftermath was not clean. There were mutual friends who didn't know how to handle it. A couple who'd been close to both of us kind of vanished. The specific social cowardice of people who don't want to pick a side, so they quietly pick neither side. That stung more than I expected. I'd had a whole group of friends for years, and suddenly some of them were just gone. Not hostile, just absent in a way that felt louder than hostility. There was also an awkward period with Nadia, Raya's sister, who I genuinely liked and who genuinely liked me. She texted me once, about a month in, just to say she was sorry for what had happened and that she thought I was a good person and that she hoped things were okay. That meant a lot. I wrote back that I appreciated it and that she was a good person too. And that was probably the end of our relationship, which was sad but made sense, and I made peace with it. My friend group eventually restabilized. People who actually cared about me found their way back to being present. Some friendships that had been sort of peripheral got deeper, Donovan and Margot, obviously. Presley and I got closer. Even Tessa. I flew to Montreal for a weekend in the spring, and we had a long overdue proper visit, and it was easy and good. There was a brief period, maybe 2 months in, where I had a rough patch emotionally. The practical stuff had kept me occupied and the honest conversation had given me a kind of closure, but there's a phase after all of that where the structure falls away and you're just sitting with the loss of a thing. Not the lost relationship, exactly. The lost future. The one you'd assumed was going to happen. That's what I was grieving. I went to therapy during this period, which I should have been doing for years, honestly, but that's another conversation. My therapist said something I've thought about a lot. She said, you built such careful architecture around your emotions in this situation. You processed from a distance, you protected yourself efficiently, you never lost control. That's a skill. But you're allowed to also just be sad. I sat with that. Then I cried. Just once, really fully. In her office. I cried about the 11 years and the Saturday mornings and the future that wasn't going to happen and the way she'd said my name like an apology. It helped. It's been about 8 months now since that Sunday morning conversation. I have a good apartment, my own apartment, in my name, with furniture I chose and a reading chair by the window that I have become deeply attached to. I've started running again, something I dropped years ago. I've been to Vancouver twice to see my sister. I went to a friend's wedding in the summer and danced badly and didn't feel sad about it. I'm okay. Better than okay, some days. But I want to tell you what I actually learned from this, because I've thought about it enough that I think I understand some of it. The half second, I keep coming back to that. Because the thing about the half second is not that it was a clue, not really. The thing about the half second is that my body knew before my brain let itself know. I already knew. I'd known something was off for longer than 4 months, if I'm honest. The half second just made me stop ignoring what I knew. I think a lot of us do this. We sense the ground shifting, and we tell ourselves we're imagining it. We explain away the half seconds. We don't ask the question we're afraid of the answer to. And the longer we wait, the more elaborate the explaining becomes. I spent months being careful and prepared, and I told myself it was wisdom, and some of it was. But some of it was also just fear. Fear of the conversation. Fear of what it would do to a life I'd spent 11 years building. That fear cost me months. Months of performing a normal relationship when I already knew it wasn't normal. I'm not sure those months did me any good. What I know now, the half second is real. The thing your body already knows is worth listening to, even if it's terrifying. You don't have to blow anything up. I'm not saying act on every flicker of instinct. But you can trust yourself. You know more than you're admitting. The other thing I learned, having your affairs in order, not in a paranoid way, just as a matter of knowing where you stand financially, legally, emotionally, is not cynical. It's not a betrayal of trust. My friend Donovan asked me recently if I missed her. I said yes. Of course I do. You don't love someone for 11 years and then cleanly stop. It doesn't work that way. Sometimes I hear a song we both liked, and it sits in my chest in a specific way. Sometimes I'll be at a restaurant we used to go to, and I'll be aware of her absence. But missing someone and needing to be with them are two different things. I didn't reach back out. I didn't try to rebuild. I think some people expected that maybe, eventually, there'd be a reconciliation arc to this story. And I'm not going to pretend I never thought about it. I did, in the early months, in that specific 3 a.m. way where grief makes you reach toward the thing you lost. But the truth is, what was broken wasn't just the fidelity. What was broken was the sense that we were building something together, honestly, in the same direction. We'd gotten comfortable in a way that had become invisible. Both of us probably. And I think we would have had to rebuild ourselves before we could rebuild anything with each other. And that's not how endings usually go. So I'm here, in my apartment, with my reading chair, running 3 mornings a week, talking to my therapist twice a month, calling my parents on Sunday evenings. A few weeks ago, I had coffee with a woman named Simone, a friend of Margot's, introduced very gently and without pressure, the way good people introduce people. We talked for 2 hours. It was easy in a way that reminded me what easy felt like, which was a good reminder to have. I don't know what happens next. That's the honest answer. But here's what I know. I caught a half-second that most people would have missed. I paid attention to what I knew, even when I was afraid of it. I didn't blow anything up, didn't become someone I didn't recognize, didn't let grief make me cruel. I handled one of the hardest things in my life with, I think, some degree of dignity. And I'm still here. That has to count for something.